are happening. We've got plenty. There we are. The lovely American ladies just reminded me that we're being recorded. So recording has started. There are different chat functions you can use. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen, you can press on chat. The chat will appear on the right-hand side. Please put any questions you wish to in there. You can also put your hand up. There will be Q&A sections within the presentations this evening. And hopefully we'll be able to get through everything that we can for you this evening. We'll be finishing at 8:30, hopefully on the dot. And Alan, if you wouldn't mind, could you please go to the first slide, which is going to introduce what we're doing this evening. So I'm going to run through the project team who are joining us this evening, the aims of the event. There will be a reintroduction to the FSM strategy, progress since January 2023, the draft proposed leading options now being consulted on will be introduced to you, and then you'll also find out how you can help inform the FSM strategy at this stage of the project, and then the next steps following consultation period. Now, I am going to introduce you to the project team, but also on the call we have Matt Hosey, who is head of FSM at BCP Council, Dave Pixley from the Environment Agency, he's the senior coastal advisor, Steve Cook from New Forest District Council, Catherine Corbin, who's the FSM Strategy Engagement lead for BCP. Thank you for joining us. So hopefully they'll be able to add to any questions, their skills and knowledge. And who is on the call from the FSM Strategy Project team this evening? Well, we have Alan Frampton from BCP Council, Peter Ferguson, who's from New Forest District Council, and also Ben Taylor, who joins us from the consultants ACOM. So he is the project manager. Okay, great. So the aims, well, main aim is to raise awareness of the work being done, to develop the Christchurch Bay and Harbour FSM strategy, how and when we will be engaging and communicating throughout the process. We will then allow the project team to feedback on progress since January 2023, introduce the draft proposed leading options that are now being consulted on, and also seek comments from stakeholders on the draft proposed leading options. And we definitely want your views on these. But we are going to kick off now, very quickly. We have a poll. It should appear on your screen. Please let us know. The question is, how did you hear about this event today? It's really important that we ensure that we are using every possible way of ensuring that people know that the strategy is being consulted upon, and we're always very interested to know what works best. So just fill the poll in. Once you all have, we will move on to the next one. Great, thank you. So click your button, it's all coming through. We're at 70%. Okay, so Maria, I can see you've written in the chat you can't hear anything. Is anyone else having issues? If you're having issues with hearing anything, can you please write it in the chat? Okay, Maria, I think it might be your end if you want to try using different headphones or different option. Yeah, maybe try re-entering, Maria. Okay, great. If everyone's nearly finished the poll. Okay, thank you. So email newsletters seem to be a really popular way of everyone hearing about this, so that's handy to know. So thank you for that. And then we shall move on to the next poll, please, Nikki. Okay, so the question for this one, please, is which area that we'll be discussing tonight are you most interested in? And if it's all of them, you can always use the other. It gives the team a really good idea of whether we're covering all of the different areas, and I feel quite positive that that appears to be happening. Thank you very much. Just keep filling it in for us. Okay, great. So good across the board. That's fantastic. Okay, thank you, Nikki. Right, we shall move on. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Alan, who is going to reintroduce the FSERM strategy. Thank you. The floor is yours, Alan.
Thanks, Sarah. So we're just going to start off. Some of you may have been to one of our previous events and have heard some of these, been seeing some of these slides before, but as a reminder for those who have and for anyone who's new to this, I'm just going to introduce a little bit about the strategy, what we're setting out to achieve. So our aim is to set out a 100-year sustainable integrated plan for managing coastal flood and erosion risk from Hengistbury Head, Longgroin to Hurst Spit at Milford and in Christchurch Harbour up to Knapp Mill and Tuckton Bridge on the Avon and Stowers. So our strategy area is the purple line shown on this map. At Hurst Spit, in the vicinity of Sturt Pond, there is a second strategy that's currently being developed. New Forest District Council and the Environment Agency are working on the Hurst Spit to Lymington strategy, and we've been coordinating across the project teams to make sure the two strategies and the options align, and there's a transition there that it will work between the two strategies. So Hurst to Lymington is currently out doing some engagement as well at the moment, and I think Pete's going to mention that towards the end. So the strategy is looking in more detail how we implement the shoreline management plan policy and vision that was adopted for Christchurch Bay and Harbour as part of the Poole and Christchurch Bay shoreline management plan in 2011, which is what's shown on this map here. So the different coloured lines indicate the SMP policy in the short, medium and long term. Blue is a policy to continue to hold the line. Purple is a policy of realigning a defence, and green is no active intervention. So you can see we've got quite a bit of blue and pink along our patch and only one or two areas of no active intervention, and that will come through as we look at the strategic options shortly. In terms of why we're doing this, well, over the next century, we designed to a 1 in 200 year standard of protection. And with projected sea level rises, it's currently forecast in the guidance we have to follow from national government. The core estimate that we are planning for is about 1.03 meters of sea level rise. And with that, for a 1 in 200 event within the strategy area, there could be up to 2,200 residential and non-residential properties at risk, most of those being around the Christchurch Harbour area. And then we've got along the open coast, we've got quite a risk of erosion. So the maps that will show up on this slide here are projections of what would happen erosion risk wise if we didn't manage the defences to prevent or reduce the chances of this happening. If we do nothing and allow erosion to occur across the coastal frontage of the bay, it's estimated there are some 1,370 properties at risk of erosion over the next century. And you can see the kind of risk bands that are projected to arise from that, which is what's driving those numbers. So as I said, this is about working out in more detail how best to implement the policy from the Shoreline Management Plan. The aim is to get this strategy approved by the Environment Agency's large project review group and adopted by both BCP and New Forest Council towards the end of the year, early next year. And with that in place, we can then bid for funding to develop business cases and schemes to actually build new defences or other measures that the strategy defines. So that's why we're taking this approach. In terms of the project process, so we've taken a staged approach. We started this back in March, April 2021. I think we were still in lockdowns. Our first engagement rounds were definitely virtual for that reason. And we've been working for the last best part of 2 years to get to this point where we've now got our draft leading proposed options to seek views on and consult on. So we're getting towards the end of the project. So our last engagement round was end of last year and closed mid-January. And since then, we've been taking on board all the feedback we had. So that engagement round was showing the assessment from long list to identify a proposed shortlist. And with the feedback, we confirmed the shortlist. And since then, Ben and the team at ACOM have been doing a more detailed appraisal on that shortlist, looking at the technical, economic, environmental and social aspects of the different options to work out what would be our draft leading options. And alongside that, we have some requirements to do range of environmental assessments. So the strategic environmental assessment, a habitat regulation assessment, a marine conservation zone assessment, and a water framework directive assessment. And the boxes here show the journey that we've been going through since last June on this options appraisal process. To do the appraisal, we've broken the strategy up into 6 strategy management zones, or SMZs, and within each of those there are a number of subunits or option development units, and the options are considered first at the option unit level, and then in combination at the SMZ level, and then in combination across the strategy area. So look at the interactions between different options and what would and wouldn't work together. And they've all been appraised on a multi-criteria basis that was informed by engagement last summer. Through that process, for each of the option units, we've identified a national economic leading option. That is the option that conforms to following the national guidance for flood and coastal erosion risk management appraisal that is defined by the Environment Agency and DEFRA. In places, we've also identified the local aspirational leading option, and that's where we've considered the views expressed through the previous engagement rounds of what locally would be preferred, and looked at where that could be an enhancement to the national leading option. Typically, these are looking to deliver a wider range of benefits to an area, and typically are desired to be done sooner and at a higher cost than the national option. And in some cases, we've got quite a big funding gap, which will become evident as we go through the presentation tonight. And we have some uncertainty about being able to achieve that. So in places, we've also identified a backup option, which is if we can't achieve the funding to do 1 or 2, this is what we would do as a fallback position to manage the risks as long as we can. In terms of how that's been run through, this just gives a flow illustration of the appraisal process Ben and his team AECOM have been through. So there's the economic appraisal, which gives us our provisional national option, and then iteration with the social environmental appraisal to confirm national economic option. And then we look at the local desires, and then finally the funding question, and do we need a backup option as well? And what's presented is 1, 2, or 3 of those options for each ODU, with a approach defined for the short term, medium term, and long term. So short term is the next 20 years, medium term 20 to 50 years, and long term 50 to 100 years. And the idea is, for the most part, you would potentially be able to flick between pathways depending on situations as it comes into account. And then the draft options are then being tested for key uncertainties with sensitivity, such as cost increases, or what if sea level rises higher and or faster than the core assessment that we're obliged to follow. And then finally, we've looked at potential impact of, if an option is not delivered in a unit, what are the knock-on effects for adjacent units?
Great, thank you, Alan. So we do have a Q&A section at this point. Has anyone got any questions? I know we had some new people join us. Thank you for that. There is a chat function you can put questions in, or please raise your hand. Otherwise, we shall move on to the next section. Okay, I can't see any questions coming through. Oh, Alan O'Sullivan, you've raised your hand. Alan, do you want to ask a question? Please unmute.
Yeah, I just wonder which of the 6 is the most vulnerable zone?
Depends how you view vulnerable. When we come through the slides in a moment, you'll see the numbers of properties and things at risk in each zone. So that might become evident as we go through.
So will that have an effect on which ones and which order that you do it in?
Well, in terms of schemes, so prioritization. So once we've gone through this consultation phase, we'll take on board feedback. We'll maybe make adjustments depending on the feedback we get. We need to do that and look at that. And then once we've got a final preferred option for each area, we will pull together a prioritized forward plan, and we will come back once everything is approved to share what the next steps are and what that's looking like. But it will depend on a number of factors in terms of, is the funding available, what's the condition of the defences, etc., as well as when is the risk arising. So those kind of things will probably become more evident as Ben talks through the options in a moment as well, but happy to come back to that question at the end if you feel it's not quite there.
Great. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Alan's for that. Liz Butterfield, Liz, you've got your hand up. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, hello. I know we're going to come on to funding, but I'm just wondering whether any additional funding resourcing might be possible, like some sort of crowdfunding locally. Can the funding that's available be supplemented by fundraising?
Good question.
That's certainly been done in other areas. It's certainly something to explore probably when we get down, once the strategy is adopted and you start looking at developing schemes in local areas, you start drilling into that more. I know other places have tried that with limited success, but it's certainly every option is open from that point of view, as long as it's legal.
Great. Okay. And Matt, you have your hand up. Do you want to add to
Yeah,
that?
just a bit of clarification on that for when we go through. So, what we're setting out within this is the funding that's available from flood defence grant and aid, that route using the FSM Ag rules that Alan's talking about. But we will certainly look at other forms of funding that are available to us, other than public sort of crowdfunding as well. So there's other areas like local levy, like SIL, and other pots that we would look at. So this is all, the strategy is all about building up the foundation to know where we sit, know how much we can get from central government, so that we can plan our way forwards once we've got that known from this strategy.
Great. Okay. Well, I think we shall move on because I think you'll have plenty of questions after the next session. So we're now going to move on to Ben is going to talk us through the draft proposed leading options that now been consulted on. Thank you, Ben. You have the floor.
Thank you. And good evening, everyone. So over the next 45 minutes or so, I'll be providing an overview of the draft proposed leading options that we've identified in each area. These are by no means finalised. They're what we're proposing as a draft, and we will be considering feedback from the public and also key stakeholders on these over the coming months before making any updates accordingly. So I'll start off with SMZ1, which is the Mudderford Sandbank and Hengistbury Head area. So this is located at the western end of the strategy frontage. We'll then move around the harbour and then along the open coast to the east until we reach Milford-on-Sea at the eastern end of the strategy area. So starting with SMZ1, it includes ODU1, which is the southeastern frontage of Hengistbury Head, just to the east of the Long Groin, and then it also includes ODU2, which covers Mudderford Sandbank. The area is important for recreation. It's got many beach huts, and it's a popular area for visitors to come to. In terms of its flood and erosion function, Mudderford Sandbank provides shelter to Christchurch Harbour. There are also a number of buried services and utilities that run beneath the sandbank and connect over to Mudderford Quay. However, in terms of flood and erosion risk to permanent properties, there are very few permanent properties on the sandbank and in this location, which really limits the amount of central government funding that may be available for coastal defences here. Next slide, please. So starting with ODU1, this is the southeastern frontage of Hengistbury Head. The option selection in this location has really been focused on how we can work with existing defences as best as possible. Due to there being very few properties here, there's not a sufficient business case and economic case to drive constructing new defences. So the national economic option here reflects this and is to do minimum. This would involve essentially undertaking small-scale maintenance of the existing defences over time, aiming to extend the service life of these assets. But there is some uncertainty with this option in terms of how long this may be feasible to do. As sea levels rise and as the defences get older, it's unlikely that these small-scale maintenance works will keep the defences functioning as they currently are, which could lead to some uncontrolled erosion of Hengistbury Head in the future. So with that in mind, we've also identified a local option, which would be delivered if funding could be found to support it. The local option is managed realignment. This would involve more investment into the existing defences than the do minimum option, and it would help ensure that they remain functional throughout the next 100 years. It would also involve some small-scale beach management, most likely through beach recycling to support the defences. This would enable the erosion of the cliff to be more controlled over time, to provide confidence in the evolution of the shoreline here, and to reduce the risks of any unexpected erosion from happening. Next slide, please. So ODU2 is Mudderford Sandbank itself, and it covers both the seaward and the harbour side of the sandbank. This area has similar funding constraints to ODU1, as there are very few permanent properties on the sandbank, so central government funding for coastal defences is likely to be quite limited. Similar to ODU1, the national economic option is to do minimum, which would involve small-scale maintenance works, the existing defences such as the groins and the seawall and the rock revetment. But there is uncertainty again with this as to how the sandbank will evolve in the future. And without more investment, there is a risk that the sandbank either rolls back into the harbour over time, or you could even get some localised breaching if beach levels do drop low enough and defences fail during storm conditions. We've also got a local aspirational option, and this aims to provide more certainty in this location by investing more into the existing defences, for example, refurbishing the existing defences when they get close to the end of their service life. We've also included in this option a beach nourishment scheme in the future to top up beach levels on the sandbank should it be required. And the aim of this option will be to preserve the flood and erosion defence function of the sandbank. This would benefit the beach huts and visitors to the sandbank, but it would also provide a wider benefit to Christchurch Harbour. It would help ensure access in and out of the harbour is not negatively impacted for long periods of time. It would also help ensure that the buried services beneath the sandbank are not interrupted by erosion. But as you would expect, it does require significantly more investment. You can see in that table on the right-hand side. And our estimated costs for the local option over the next 100 years are around 15 million. Okay, so next slide, please. So yeah, I appreciate I ran through that quite quickly.
Have we any questions at this point? Okay, we have, I'm not even going to attempt to say your surname, Jay Kalazowski?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Oh, thank you. Please do ask your question.
Yeah, I just wondered whether in the analysis of the Mudderford Sandbank, whilst there's no properties there, clearly if that sandbank is eroded and breached, then other properties are at risk in the harbour. And, you know, that once that happens, then the cost of actually replacing the sandbank would be quite high. I wonder if that's been factored into the assessment.
Yes, as part of our developing our baseline understanding, we modelled in a hydraulic model a breach of the sandbank approximately 100 metres wide, just to understand what impact that would have on the wave activity in the harbour. And what we found even with a breach that wide, the waves wouldn't, or the model was suggesting the waves wouldn't increase significantly in the areas where you have got properties at risk. It was all in the order of 10 to 20 centimetres maximum. The full-scale loss of the sandbank is another issue. Given that there is some sediment movement around the long groin to replenish the sandbank at the moment naturally, I think our feeling is that over time, if it would almost self-repair, and it wouldn't necessarily be a permanent loss. I don't know if any others have got any thoughts on that to add.
I mean, historically, there have been breaches of that sandbank, and the concrete wall that was installed, I don't know how many decades ago, but you know, there has been obviously work done to reinforce and strengthen that sandbank and protect it from those sort of breaches.
Yeah, I think that was the basis for the scheme that we have there now that was installed in the 2000s. So the idea is with the local option is to maintain that scheme that's there now to reduce that risk from happening. The other question we have is if we did stop managing that and the breaches were to develop, is the wider implications for the sediment and hydrodynamics for the wider area as well. So there's quite a lot of uncertainty if we did that, which we don't necessarily, models can tell you so much, but there is a still inherent uncertainty in that. And the principle we've had with the long groin is that it's too uncertain to do anything other than replace it like for like. So if that principle holds on the adjacent bit of coast as well, you would say managing the spit, the sandbank in its current form is the least risky option.
Yeah, I was just wondering why it didn't quite pass the national hurdle. Is it just because there's no immediate housing, even though housing could be at risk?
It's going to sound blunt, but beach huts in the national guidance are not worth anything. And I know that's controversial given how much those beach huts transact for, but we aren't allowed to count that in the economics. They're temporary structures. So we can only count permanent buildings, which is the 6 that we have counted.
Yeah, I was just more interested in the knock-on effects on the harbour side and all the properties on that.
It's, as Ben said, the modelling we've done indicates it's very low additional impact in the harbour. It doesn't really tick any significant extra properties from doing it as well. So
is that so? When you do the hydraulic modelling, is that with surge conditions from the sea, or is that sort of just static pressure?
No, so we modelled an extreme storm event with a breach in place just to see what we did. I think we did a range of return periods, but we certainly looked at the 1 in 200 year storm return period, which is quite an extreme, well, a very extreme event, and modelled the waves through the breach during that return period.
Okay.
Gentlemen, if you don't mind me interrupting, we've got lots of questions coming through. Thank you for that, though. But Matt, you had your hand up first, and I'm going to come to David Newman, then I have some from the chat.
Yeah, just to reinforce some of the bits that Alan and Ben have mentioned, and to go back to the fact that we use this as a foundation for us to sort of understand our next steps. And one of the things we've talked about for the split is recognizing how it interacts with the broader environment and Hengstbury Head itself and the long groin. Is we may look in the future to try and embed that with the Poole Bay beach management type business case. So, we're playing with the national sort of funding rules in a sense, but we know that Mudderford spit feature, has dependencies with the long groin, and also with how the harbour side of double dykes could be affected. So, we as a team, we're looking at other options to find funding for us to allow us to do those maintenance works if we need them.
Okay, thank you. David Newman, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. So it's just a comment building on the previous point about the model doesn't allow for economic value because they're temporary structures. But it just occurs to me that actually the sand spit is a special case in terms of the extreme high value of them all be temporary beach huts there, and therefore it might be something that the owners of those beach huts might be prepared to fund a levy, especially if it's over 25 to 30 years. I mean, that £15 million is a big number, but actually over 30 years split between everyone, it might well be that there is an affordable levy with some top-up funding from, where to be decided. So I think that it's worth just noting that is a, something that's probably quite quirky, and you might be able to fund through alternative means, such as a levy.
Thank you. Did Ben, do you want to?
Yeah, I think that's
just a statement. Okay, cool.
I can answer that one, Sarah. Just to say, yes, certainly recognise that, and with this being the foundation, like I say, it allows us to have that conversation because it obviously represents quite an income stream to the council. So if you were to allow it to breach, then we need to understand those impacts and where contributions may come from, because there's various methods we could look at raising income to do works, and that could be one.
Okay,
I think
excellent.
just to add to that, whilst we're on it, we have, as part of the strategy and part of the baseline evidence base, we have valued the local economic impact of tourism and recreation to the whole strategy frontage, including Mudderford Sandbank. And whilst that's not included in the numbers shown on these slides, it can provide the evidence base moving forward to help with those funding discussions, just to illustrate how important areas are.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to dash over to the chat questions, if that's all right, Ben. So from Robert Dumrose, is the first plan choice always the national option? I'm asking, as I've noticed for all ODU in Zone 6, the local option delivers more for less money. So in that case, local preferred option would save money compared to the national option, which funding could then be used for other zones. Would anyone like to give me a brief answer for Robert on that one?
I think that's talking about the next section, so that's probably a timely one to move on to and talk
Okay.
about it there.
Okay, and before we move on, Julian and Carol, I've got your question. We will do it after the next section. We do have an awful lot of slides to get through, Ben, so we'll see how the Q&A goes and whether we bulk it up a bit more to the end, but please keep putting your questions in the chat. We will come to them. Thanks, Ben, if you want to continue.
Okay, so next slide, please. Thank you. So, so SMZ2, so this covers the Christchurch Harbour area spanning ODU 3s to ODU 11. There are a number of different risks in this location. The primary driver for intervening with upgraded defences is the large number of properties that are expected to be at risk from tidal flooding in the future due to sea level rise. We've also got several historic landfill sites that are located around the harbour that, if left undefended, could erode in the future and release potentially contaminated materials into the environment. We don't know a huge amount about what's in those historic landfill sites, but we generally erred on the side of caution with the options and aim to defend them. There's also several European and national environmental designations in the harbour that we need to be aware of and work towards limiting our impact on them and even improving them. So I'll go into detail in the coming slides, but I think in essence, the leading options for the ODUs in Christchurch Harbour are focused on improving the defences in low-lying areas at different points in time, and the timing of those improvements will be determined by the rate of sea level rise and the onset of risk in each particular location. And then secondly, we're looking to provide erosion defences to the historic landfill sites that are dotted around the harbour. Next slide, please. So starting at ODU 3, it's on the south side of the harbour, we'll work clockwise around the harbour, but starting at ODU 3, this location is currently, it's largely undefended. There are only a very small number of properties at risk here from flooding. But there are two large areas of historic landfill site that we need to consider, and also the key access road as well onto Mudderford Sandbank around the back of Hengistbury Head. So similar to ODUs 1 and 2, ODU 3 is another area where, due to there being a very small number of properties at risk here, there's generally quite a poor economic case to invest large amounts of new defences. The national option is focused on adaptation and resilience, so it would involve undertaking small-scale property level protection and resilience measures on an individual property by property basis where properties are at risk of flooding. Generally quite a low cost solution, but it does not help manage the risks associated with the historic landfill sites. So we've also got a local aspirational option that goes a step further and looks to address the risks of these two areas. So in addition to the property level protection that would be undertaken as part of the national option, the local option also includes small-scale erosion defences around the historic landfill site at Wick, and also the access road onto Mudderford Sandbank. Next slide, please. So ODU 4, so this is located just to the west of ODU 3. It covers the urban area of Wick, where the flood risk is expected to increase quite significantly in the future. There's currently a setback embankment located in the northeast corner of this unit that provides some flood protection to the area, but with sea level rise, the defence will begin to be outflanked and overtopped in the future. The national economic option recommends extending and raising this defence over time in several increments, which will reduce the risk of flooding to this location. Again, we've got a historic landfill site here. This is located just to the north, just behind the existing quay wall that's shown in green on the top figure. The local aspirational option here would include proactive maintenance and refurbishments of that existing quay wall, which will protect the historic landfill site from erosion. The local option also includes works to improve the setback defences in the east part of the unit that are included in the national option. Being a frontline structure, that frontline quay wall is quite costly to refurbish in the future and to maintain over the next 100 years. So you can see there's around about a £7 million difference in cost between the national and the local options. Next slide, please. So ADU 5 is located just on the other side of the River Stour to ADU 3. The flood risk in this location is currently managed by a scheme that was constructed in the 90s. However, over time, as sea levels rise, the defences will need to be improved to sustain the standard of protection that is currently provided. Similar to ADUs 3 and 4, we've also got a number of historic landfill sites here that need to be managed here too. The largest of which is at the eastern end of the unit, beneath the Quamps Recreation Ground. There's a large number of properties that are expected to be at risk from flooding in this location in the future. Therefore, there's a reasonably strong economic case to improve the defences. The national option involves improving the defences from Epoch 2, so between the 2040s and 2070s, whereas the local option involves doing this much sooner, so in Epoch 1. And the benefit of doing it sooner would just be to provide that confidence around the standard of protection in the short term, as well as defending the historic landfill site at the Quamps. As a capital scheme would involve either replacement or refurbishment of that existing masonry quay wall. In terms of the alignment for the new defences, the strategy's identified different defence alignments that could be selected, either a setback alignment, frontline alignment, or even a combination of the two. It's not necessarily something we'll be able to bottom out at the strategy level, so the alignment would undergo further appraisal during subsequent design work after the strategy when a scheme is being thought about. The options here have quite a high cost, estimated to be upwards of 27 million, but due to the number of properties that could be at risk here from flooding, we would expect several £1 million to be available from central government to help fund the scheme here. But again, there would be a large part of the scheme costs would need to be funded from elsewhere, so from other funding partners to deliver these options. And recognising that potentially substantial funding gap, we've also identified a backup option here. It's generally a lower cost solution. This backup option is to maintain the existing defences and then undertake property level resilience and protection measures to help manage the flood risk. It wouldn't have such a large one-off capital funding requirement for a scheme. Next slide, please. So ADU 6, so this spans the west bank of the River Avon up to Knapp Mill. There's primarily two areas in this unit that are expected to be at increased risk from flooding in the future. So these are at the southern extent, so around Elkins Boatyard, and then further to the north in the vicinity of Castle Street. In order to defend both areas with new defences, you would need relatively long lengths of defences to protect a comparatively smaller number of properties. So the cost of new defences relative to the benefits is generally quite weak in this location. So with that in mind, the approach identified for the national option is therefore one of adaptation and resilience, which would be to focus on a property basis and involve managing the risk at that property level through property level resilience and protection measures, whilst maintaining the existing quay walls. Next slide, please. So ADU 7, so this is the Rosters Quay area on the island, I guess, in the middle of the Avon, the two river channels on either side of it. There's a number of existing defences currently in this location which provide a reasonably high standard of protection at the moment. And given that this is the case, new defences are not required in this location immediately. The national option recommends improving the defences or constructing new defences from Epoch 2 onwards. And the estimated cost for doing that is around 7 million. And initial indications indicate around 15 to 20% of that cost would be available from central government funding. So there would also be a requirement for partnership funding from other sources to help deliver this option here. The backup option here wouldn't require such a large funding amount for a capital scheme and could therefore be more deliverable. And similar to adjacent areas, the backup option would involve tackling the risk on a property by property basis through property level resilience and protection measures. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've jumped from 7 to 9. So we're passing over ODU 8 because we've agreed with the Environment Agency that this area would be covered by a different project, which would be led by them. So ODU 8 essentially covers the east bank of the River Avon to the north of the bypass. And the flood risk here is more fluvially dominated. So the Environment Agency are picking up that area separately. But on to ODU 9, this is located just to the east of ODU 7, on the east bank of the River Avon, around the Stampit area. There's two main risks here, so the flood risk coming from the Avon and the Harbour, and then the risk of erosion to the historic landfill that's located at Stampit Recreation Ground. There's a reasonably strong economic case here for improving the defences in the future, as the flood risk is projected to be quite extensive and lots of properties are at risk. The national option involves defences from Epoch 2, so improving the defences from Epoch 2 when the flood risk would otherwise be expected to increase if nothing was done. There's currently a floods defence scheme in ODU 9, shown in yellow in the top figure. And it's likely that upgraded defences could follow a similar or exactly the same alignment in the future. And then in the south part of the unit around the recreation ground, the defences also need to be improved, so raised and strengthened to prevent erosion of the historic landfill sites over time. So as part of this option, we've also signposted there may be opportunities for salt marsh enhancement and restoration in the area of salt marsh just to the south of the recreation ground. And these opportunities will be explored over the coming years. The salt marsh is quite important because it provides a natural coastal defence as it helps to attenuate wave energy. But in the future, there's a real risk that with sea level rise, the salt marsh could be quite threatened as it become more and more inundated over time. So improving the salt marsh habitat in the future really would make it more resilient to this change. It would help provide a biodiversity net gain. It would also help with the flood and erosion risk too. The cost for the national option is estimated to be in the order of £21 million. And like other areas, it's likely the majority of this will need to be funded via partnership funding. Initial indications suggest around £3 million of funding may be available from central government for this location. With quite a large funding gap, we've also identified a backup option similar to other areas, maintenance of existing defences, and then dealing with the flood risk on a property by property basis. Next slide, please. Okay, so ODU 10, this covers the area between Stampit and Mudford Quay in the east. Many of the properties along this part of the frontage already have property level resilience and protection measures, but with sea level rise, we expect the flood risk to worsen over time here. But it's not really until Epoch 3 that there's a strong enough economic case to improve the defences here. And the national option therefore involves recommending constructing either new defences or raising existing quay walls from Epoch 3. In the interim period, it's recommended that properties continue to manage flood risk on a property by property basis with ongoing property level resilience and protection measures. Given the frontline nature of the defence scheme recommended in Epoch 3, it's likely to be quite costly, and there's likely to be a large amount of funding required to deliver this option. So again, we have a similar backup option to adjacent areas based on maintaining existing defences with continued property level protection measures. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the last ADU in SNZ2, which covers the Mudford Quay area. Relative to other areas around Christchurch Harbour, there's a very small amount of properties in this unit that are at risk from flooding. So building an economic case to improve defences here is really, really difficult. The national economic option is to do minimum, which would involve ongoing small-scale repair and maintenance of existing quay walls and setback defences. But we also have a local aspirational option here, which would involve undertaking more proactive maintenance and refurbishments of the quay walls, as well as property level protection measures to the properties at risk of flooding. And this local option would provide more confidence in the long-term functioning of the quay walls, which are important for the overall morphology and navigation in the area and entrance into the harbour. Okay, I think that's it.
Thank you, Ben. Great, thanks, Ben. Before we move to questions, Ben, from the chat, which we have some really excellent ones, just a reminder from Catherine, these slides are available for you to refer to again on the Have Your Say BCP Council Christchurch Strategy Phase 5 section on the website. So if you look in the chat, it'll give you a link to that. But I have a question that came through from Julian Carroll, Ben, which is an interesting one. Is the whole life cost calculated over the 100-year period from 2023 to 21-23? And is the estimated government funded amount for the same period, or is it for a shorter time horizon, for instance, 5 years?
Question. So the whole life costing, you're correct, it's based on the full 100-year appraisal period. The amount of central government funding that we're estimating is based on the major capital scheme as part of an option. So say for example, we have an option that involves upgrading the defences in year 20. That major capital scheme in year 20, that's what the funding amount is referring to.
Okay, thank you. And Russ put an interesting question in, but Dave Pixley from the A has sort of answered it. It was about the choice of Tuckton Bridge on the River Stour as the boundary for Christchurch Harbour, and would Iford Bridge not be better? Dave, I will just repeat what you've put in the chat. The choice of Tuckton Bridge is to align with the existing shoreline management plan and remain consistent across our strategic plans. Further upstream is covered by the Lower Stour strategy being developed by the Environment Agency at the moment. Okay, so Russ, I hope that helps. And there was another question that I did go through before. Can we just try and pop back to that? Is the first plan choice always the national option? Anyone want to come? Alan?
Yeah, so I think it was previously relating to ODU 6, but I realised as you went through,
yeah.
there isn't a separate cross. So I was wondering if it referring to a different ODU.
Could
But
be.
Generally speaking, the preferred option or the leading option has to be the national one, because that's the consistent one that we've defined for each section. But generally there is flexibility between the two. I think you were questioning the relative cost. Some of the local ones seemed lower cost. It's probably Ben's done.
Yeah, I think you may be
that
referring to SM. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you may be referring to SMZ 6 rather than ODU 6, because in SMZ 6 some of the local options are lower cost.
Okay, well we will be coming to that.
Yeah.
Won't we, Ben? Can I just very quickly, because he has been patient, Emlyn, you do have a question. Emlyn, would you want to unmute?
I have. Can you hear me, Sarah?
Yep, go ahead,
Okay.
Emlyn.
Thank you, Sarah. So this is a comment that could be made about the updates that we're getting today on any of the sections of the coast. So permit me just to make a comment that's broad. And I do this as a long view geologist with a public sort of mindset. I'd like to suggest respectfully that the reports on any of the results of any of these studies will do a public service of great proportion if they level with the public what are the latest understandings of the risks to both the sort of low validity of planning timeframes, like a 200-year event. There's been mentioned already in this report over its 100-year timeframe of based on 200-year something, fill in the blank. There's widespread doubt worldwide that with the unpredictable greater frequency of extreme weather, as well as climate warming, that these so-called return periods of planning are not really worth very much. And so I think we owe the public, we being the scientific community, if I could speak in that capacity, to explain, to level with the public, that we actually, in putting these plans forward, which are our best efforts, we really don't know what is the changing frequency of extreme events. I think the national coverage in the news of the Norfolk coast, where people at the top of cliffs are expressing repeatedly great surprise that their kitchens and living rooms are falling into the North Sea is a case in point. Ultimately, this is going to be a case of managed retreat. These plans will only last so long, just as all the previous planning phases have lasted over the last 100 years, whether they were crude or sophisticated at the given time. So my recommendation, therefore, respectfully, is to couch any of these reports in the context of the knowledge we have as it is evolving of the diminished return period confidence of these planning timeframes, and also to level that we actually are going to have to, in the end, incrementally deal with managed retreat, that these plans are only going to be good for so long.
Okay, thank you, Emlyn, for that comment, which will have been recorded. Does anyone want to quickly come back on that before we move on to the plans, which I'm sure people are keen to see? Thank you, Emlyn.
Yeah, I'll just comment on that. Yeah, I mean, we should only ever view these as probably buying us time, given the direction of travel with the science. I mean, we have to follow the national guidance that we're doing, and we have sensitivity tested against H++ scenario in the sensitivity testing with this. It does give us an adaptable framework. As we go forward, we'll review and update the strategy every so often as we develop the schemes, and if the science changes, we can review and revisit. We've got feedback opportunities within the approach, but based on the understanding at the moment, this is where we're going. So
thanks, Alan. And there's a super quick one, Ben, before you move on. Why are the historic landfill sites so relevant? That's from Elaine.
Mainly from an environmental perspective. I mean, at the moment, there's a huge amount of uncertainty as to what materials are in those historic landfill sites. And if we were just to leave them undefended, there's a real risk that some potentially nasty stuff could be released out into the environment. From a water body perspective, we need to be mindful of the Water Framework Directive, and it's not ideal to be potentially leading to detriment of any water bodies on the coastline. It's a national issue, and it's gaining more focus. The real challenge we have at the moment is the funding system isn't necessarily set up to help defend historic landfill sites. It's all focused on protecting properties. So that's often why it's our local aspirational option around Christchurch Harbour to defend the historic landfill sites, whereas the national option, it's not.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Right. Okay, should we move on? Ben, you've got about 20 minutes. Oh, Matt's coming in.
So I'd very quickly add to that, just to say that we are lobbying as a team around funding for landfill. We've led on research. You know, the scientists within our team have led on research on that. So it is something we're actively seeking funding for, but it's just not fitting with the government rules at present.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, Ben, do you want to continue? We've got about 20 minutes, Ben, for the rest of this section. So anyone who wants to ask questions, please do put them in the chat. Okay,
so SMZ 3, so this covers the open coast area between Mudderford Quay and Chewton Bunny. The risks here are very different to the harbour area. The primary risk here is erosion of the cliff line, which could lead to loss of properties in the future if that's unmanaged. We've got two ODUs here, ODU 12 and ODU 13. Next slide, please. So ODU 12 expands the area between Mudderford Quay along the coastline just to the, and then finishes just to the east of Steamer Point. Topography gets higher, moving west to east along the frontage, and is currently defended by a mixture of sea walls, groins, and a rock revetment. As sea levels rise, the existing defence is likely to become under increased pressure and will need to be replaced, refurbished, and raised to provide the same standard of protection that they currently provide. The national option here involves maintaining existing defences in the short term before constructing new groins and undertaking a beach nourishment scheme in the medium term. This would add more beach material to the area, which would provide an improved first line of defence against the sea. The local aspiration option goes a step further. It would bring forward that groin upgrade and beach nourishment scheme to be much sooner in EPOP 1 to provide greater confidence in the short term for the protection. There's also potential to include broader public realm improvements to this area, such as promenade raising, in the future as well. So the cost of the national and local options, it varies around 17 to 21 million. That local cost could change substantially depending on if or how much public realm improvements would be undertaken. We've also identified a backup option, sorry, in the last one, which is essentially a scaled back version of the national and the local options with a smaller beach nourishment volume placed on the beach. Next slide, please. So at U13, this covers the Highcliffe area from Highcliffe Castle to the eastern end of the defences next to Chewton Bunny. Currently, this area is quite well defended. There's a large rock revetment and rock groins, which are holding the beach material in place, and then a very successful cliff stabilisation scheme here as well, which has stabilised the cliff. There is, however, a risk of outflanking the existing defences here if nothing's done to reduce the rate of erosion at Naish to the east. The national option involves managing that outflanking risk with a localised defence at the eastern end of the unit, and then maintenance of this defence and the current defences will then take place thereafter. Subject to the beach levels in the future, we've also included provision for a beach nourishment scheme in Epoch 3 should it be needed to top up beach levels. The local aspirational option is the same essentially, but you're just bringing forward the major beach nourishment scheme to be much sooner during Epoch 2 to provide more confidence in the medium term defence system. Again, we've got a backup option here, similar to AD12, which is just essentially a scaled back version of the national and local options with a smaller beach nourishment volume in the future. Okay.
Thanks, Ben. Any specific questions on those points raised? Jan has asked, Ben, if you don't mind going backwards a little bit, how far back do these landfill sites go? I think, do you mean back in time, Jan? How old they are? I'm assuming that's what you mean.
If it's, I'm unsure on time, but if it's spatially, they're all shown on the figures where they're located.
Right. Okay. Yes, that was the question. Right. Okay.
In time, they go back over the last century or more. Some are certainly 19th century.
Thanks, Alan. And just quickly for everyone, Dave Pixley from the AS has popped in a link in the chat to a great piece of work locally, which highlights some of the extreme events that we have been experiencing in recent times and a look at the impacts of sea level rise and increasing storminess. So it's a research studies, put a link in there. Okay, thank you, Ben.
So SMZ4, so this covers the Naish Cliff and Barton-on-Sea frontage, which is a particularly complex area to manage. The geology of the cliff here makes it particularly unstable. Erosion of the cliff is driven by two key processes. There's erosion of the cliff toe by waves in the sea, which can make the cliff unstable, and then there's instability as well caused by groundwater and rainfall, which can cause landsliding. With just general affordability constraints for coastal defences, this makes it particularly challenging to control the rate of erosion here and to defend the properties that are located along the cliff top. At the moment, the undefended area at Naish in the west part of the unit, it's quickly eroding. The central and eastern parts of the unit are a bit more stable, but they're still prone to erosion events. At the moment, the central and eastern area of the unit relies on defences at the cliff toe and also a cliff drainage system to reduce the rate of erosion. But this cliff drainage system has failed in a number of places, particularly in the central part of the unit. Next slide, please. So given the complexities associated with the cliffs here, the national, economic and also local aspirational options recommend an overall managed realignment approach. This managed realignment approach will aim to control the rate of erosion of the cliff, but it should be recognised that it won't stop erosion entirely. For both the local and national options, significant investment in the future will be needed to control the rates of erosion. This will involve constructing improved defences at the toe of the cliff between the urbanised area of Barton-on-Sea, so from Marine Drive West all the way up to the eastern end. New cliff drainage would also be installed in the areas that it has previously failed. At the western end of the frontage at Naze Cliff, there wouldn't be any new defences put into place here, but a beach nourishment scheme would take place to top up the beach level here. This would help to provide improved toe protection at the base of the cliff, which could slow the overall erosion rate. Again, it wouldn't stop it, and gradually over time, the beach material would be expected to kind of drift eastwards and provide a broader benefit to tow the defences further to the east along the rest of the Barton frontage. The main difference between the national and the local options comes down to the timing of the intervention. So the national option would involve undertaking these upgrades and beach nourishment scheme in Epoch 2 when there's a much stronger economic case to do so, whereas the local option would involve doing it much sooner, so during Epoch 1. Both options involve extensive new defences and cliff drainage works, which yeah, they're not cheap. Estimated costs of around 45 million. And there is a large funding gap for this that will need to be found to deliver these options. If funding can't be found, the backup option here is to focus on just maintaining existing defences as best as we can where they have already failed. This is a much lower cost solution. It'd be more deliverable, but at the same time, it would more than likely lead to significantly more damages and property loss along the cliff top, particularly in the western part of Barton-on-Sea. Okay.
Okay, I do have a question request comment that's come through directly to me. It's an interesting one though, Ben. Can we see a breakdown somewhere of the national versus local whole life cost and available government funding broken down across short, mid, long term, as the information document only provides the overall totals? It would be useful to see the spend versus the shortfalls in, say, the short-term period. Only as for the public, it's easier for us to get our heads around shortfall funding for the next 20 years rather than looking out over 100 years, which is a good point.
Yeah, there's not any report which currently has that, but we are preparing an economics report that I'll make sure includes that information.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, Ben, you want to keep going?
Okay, so this one should be a quick one. SMZ5 covers the undefended coastline between Barton-on-Sea and Hordle Cliff, where there's very few properties at risk here from erosion. Next slide, please. ODU 15 is the sole unit here. The national option is to do nothing, which will mean that the cliffs continue to erode naturally as they currently are. There is a benefit to this. It will provide important beach material to the area to the east and will ensure that the SSI status of the cliffs is also not impacted by any coastal defence works. Okay, next slide, please. Any questions on that unit?
Nope, no hands up. Okay, Ben, keep going.
Okay, so our final SMZ, we're almost there. So this covers the Milford-on-Sea frontage. A variety of risks here. So the whole frontage is at risk of coastal erosion of the cliff line. There's also been a strong trend of beach erosion and beach lowering along much of this area, which is putting pressure on the defence at the top of the beach and can cause some instability of those defences. At the eastern end of the zone as well, where the land level is much lower, there's also a risk of coastal flooding from two sources, from over the front due to wave overtopping, and also around the back from the step one direction from behind her spit. The options in this area are primarily focused on effective beach management and include strategically placed beach nourishment schemes along this frontage. It's also worth bearing in mind that this area will also benefit from any beach nourishment that occurs further west in Christchurch Bay, as the natural movement of material is from west to east. Okay, next slide, please. So ODU 16 covers the western end of SMZ6. So most of the unit is undefended here. There are many beach huts at the cliff toe and a key car park located on the cliff top. If nothing's done here, we'd expect erosion to result in loss of the beach huts, erosion of the cliff top, and then damage or even loss to Cliff Road in the future, which would impact access to the west and east. The national economic option and local option are focused on controlling the rate of erosion in the future so that Cliff Road remains defended. This would be achieved by undertaking a beach nourishment scheme to create a wide beach here in this location, and also the construction of a localized defence that would act as a strong point and help control any further erosion that may occur. Both the national and local options are termed as mandatory alignment, as some erosion of the cliff would inevitably occur with this option, but through the intervention proposed, it would be much more controlled relative to a do-nothing scenario. Difference between national and local primarily relates to timing. So national is delaying the intervention until later in Epoch 2, whereas the local option is bringing it forward. And just referring to the question from earlier on, we've also assumed that with the national option, given that it's delaying the intervention until later on in the appraisal period, that a much larger strong point would be required, which would cost more, hence the national option being a higher cost relative to the local. Next slide, please. So ADU 17 is to the east of ADU 16, covers the Brook Cliff area. There's currently a rock revetment here along this frontage, and some sections also have a seawall located behind it. If nothing's done in the future, the effectiveness of the defences would be expected to reduce over time as sea levels rise, leading to erosion and potentially failure of the defences in time. The national option involves maintaining the existing defences during Epoch 1 and then upgrading the defences in Epoch 2 so they can perform as intended with higher sea levels in the future. The local option is similar to the national, except that it involves upgrading the defences much sooner during Epoch 1, which provide that greater certainty in the short term. Relatively costly solutions here, given the long length of defence that is needed, estimated cost of around 14 to 17 million. And we've also identified a backup option, which essentially is to involve maintaining existing defence of the toe as best as possible, a lower cost solution, but there is question marks over the long-term sustainability of this, particularly with the trend of falling beach levels here. And last slide, please. So ADU 18, so this is the final ADU to talk through. It's the eastern end of the strategy frontage. The area is currently defended by a seawall. There's groins to help hold the beach in place, and the beach is widely used by the public. But being backed by the hard defences such as seawall at the moment, the beach is expected to be even more vulnerable to beach erosion and lowering in the future as sea levels rise. Therefore, both the national and economic option, national and local option involve a large beach nourishment scheme in this location, which would be undertaken alongside improvements to the groins as well as the seawall to reduce wave overtopping risk. This option also involves a setback defence on the step one side of the area to reduce that backdoor flood risk from that direction. Similar to adjacent areas, the national option involves delaying this intervention into the Epoch 2, whereas the local option involves doing it in Epoch 1. And similar to adjacent areas, a vast proportion of the overall cost would need to be funded from partnership funding rather than central government. Okay, I think that's it. I think you're on mute, Sarah.
It had to happen at some point, didn't it? Right, okay, thank you, Ben, ever so much. Right, okay, we have 5 minutes for question and answers on Ben's section there. Please do raise your hand virtually or pop into the questions. Right, coming through the chat. Oh, Robert, yes, it did get answered. Robert missed the answer. We'll come back, Robert, if we can at the end for that. Carol says for SMZ6 seems a bit crazy, delaying intervention for 20 years resulting in national being more expensive than local option.
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to this. I'll answer Robert's question at the same time as well. So ADU 16, the national option involves delaying the intervention, like you say, until Epoch 2. And with that, we've assumed that a larger strong point and beach nourishment scheme would be needed to help control the rates of erosion from that point forward, because there would be an element of erosion that's happened between now and then, which you wouldn't necessarily have with the local approach. That's why the costs on this slide are higher for the national option. When you look at kind of deviating away from this a bit, but when we look at from a Environment Agency perspective, we have to present all our costs in discounted terms, which means that when you look at things in discounted terms, because your national intervention is being delayed into the future, it has a higher discount rate applied to it. So from an Environment Agency perspective, the local option would remain the least cost. But from a cash perspective, without any discounting, you're right, it does seem crazy to delay it. And I think that's something we're pushing for, is to do that local aspirational option rather than the national here.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Okay, any more questions? Right, Matt has his hand up. Matt,
Yeah,
floor is yours.
just to expand on that point as well. You know, we've recognised that exact point, and this is you know, in some cases where the national funding rules don't seem sort of fair in a sense, and having a discounted sort of approach to a cliff zone where, you know, if something goes over the cliff, it's gone, it's lost. It's not like a flooding event where houses are recoverable. So totally agree with the point. It's something that we've talked about doing some sensitivity testing on as well once the strategy is finished, so that we can sort of take that message nationally and have that debate with the national funding rules and how they're set, just to show that sort of vulnerability. So yeah, completely agree. And we spoke about this at the consultation event, actually, Ben, didn't we? Where we said actually when we get LPRG, the large project review group, on site to talk about the strategy, it's something that we plan on discussing and you know, seeing if there is any potential in lobbying for rule changes.
Brilliant, thanks, Matt. That's excellent. Do we have any more questions? Anyone want to raise a hand, ask their question, unmute before we move on? No, great. Okay, let's move on to Pete then. Thanks, Ben, so much for that. It's a lot to get through. Right, now I welcome Pete Ferguson from New Forest District Council. Pete is going to talk to us once we move on to how you, and this is really, really important, how you can inform the FSIM strategy you already have this evening, but the floor is yours, Pete. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Well, firstly, to say that on behalf of the team, we're very grateful that you've taken the time to attend this event this evening and are engaged with the strategy. Up until this stage of the process, nearly 12,000 people have viewed the strategy website information. Around 5,500 has engaged with our social media posts. 680 have attended our face-to-face and online events, and over 250 people have completed a survey. These early engagements have all been leading up to this important stage, the statutory public consultation on the draft FSIM strategy. The formal 3-month period for the consultation commenced on the 5th of June, with a press briefing issued to promote its commencement. During this period, an online survey will be available to allow all stakeholders to give their views on the leading options for the 6 strategy zones. And we're keen to seek as many views as possible. And the more surveys that are completed, the better, gives a better sample size and therefore greater insight into general opinion, providing more value to the data. So if you think others who may have a view and are not aware, please do feel free to spread the word so they have an opportunity to share their views on the proposed leading options too. So to help inform matters, on the BCP web Have Your Say website, it's home to a wealth of supporting information, including the engagement phase reports produced for each of the previous 4 stages, plus links to the earlier option development report, the long list and the short list reports, which form the development behind the leading options report, together with the accompanying strategic environment assessment. It is, however, appreciated that these reports are quite technical, so there is also a useful consultation document to assist this process, which clearly explains this concisely and presents the leading options for the different units. Alongside this is the draft strategy document, which again presents the process in a clear and illustrative manner. Hopefully, this should be a useful resource to any stakeholder wishing to make informed comments. In addition to the survey, comments anywhere along the area can also be made by dropping pins into a strategy map, which allows remarks to be made about a specific area if required. So 2 face-to-face exhibition events have already been held over the past couple of weeks, which have been very well attended. The strategy will also have representation on New Forest District Council's climate and coast themed stand at for 3 days at the New Forest show later in July. There will also be representation of the strategy at the next round of public exhibitions for the neighbouring Hurst to Lymington strategy on the 12th of July, and that will be held at All Saints Church in Milford-on-Sea into the evening from 2 p.m. till 7, where NFDC officers will be on hand to discuss the strategy, hand out flyers, copy of the information, and, as well as the stakeholder survey. To obtain a paper copy of the survey and consultation document, these are available at Christchurch, Highcliffe, Lymington, Milton and Tuckton libraries. And the 3-month consultation period will close at midnight on Sunday, the 27th of August. So what are the next steps? Once the consultation ends, the feedback will be analysed and considered during the autumn-winter period, with appropriate modifications made to finalise the strategy in terms of the leading options and the strategic environmental assessment. Work will then be undertaken to seek approval from the Environment Agency and Natural England on the habitat regulations, the Marine Conservation Zone and Water Framework Directive assessments, which consider the impacts of the leading options. Following this, the process will seek adoption by both BCP Council and New Forest District Council, and this will be undertaken through the various council committees. Depending on the time required to gain approvals, the strategy will then seek approval from the Environment Agency's large project review group, who are the project sponsors, and this will be around early 2024. Then following on in the spring of that year will be engagement round 6, which is an opportunity to share the final adopted and approved strategy with stakeholders to discuss what it means and what happens next. Again, likely to be in the form of drop-in sessions and probably an online version where the final strategy will be presented to the public. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Pete, for that. Do we have any questions? We did have one from Robert, but I think that's been answered about timings of the final strategy. Emlyn has just popped in another question. I'll pop it out to you because we do have time for that. What are the whole study's estimated minimum and maximum totals of its projected funding needs, please? Anyone want to have a go at that one?
I can answer that.
Go on, Alan.
I've added
Go
it
on,
up.
Alan.
So
okay.
For BCP, if you add up the numbers that Ben's presented today, it's of the order of 100 to 140 million. And for the New Forest area, it's of the order of 90 to 95 million in cash terms over 100 years. So you're looking at, what's that, 200, 250 million, roughly thereabouts, give or take 10 million.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Alan, for that. Right, have we got any more questions about how people can engage with the consultation or anything else? Do raise your hand or pop it in the chat before we move on. Okay, thank you, Pete, for that. Right, Nikki, I think we can go to our next poll. So it's very important to us to find out how you found today's event in terms of the information presented. So please do complete the poll. Was there too much information? Was it too technical? Was it just about right or not enough information? I'll just wait for people to choose. If you just hit the buttons. Thank you very much, and thank you. I'll use this opportunity to thank everyone who's presented this evening, but in particular to all of you who have given your time up on this lovely summer's evening, although it's a bit cooler than it has been, but we appreciate your time and for listening and for all of the interesting questions asked. If you want to just finish the poll, and then my good colleague Nikki will close it down. Okay, thank you. So it seems that the majority of people, 88%, felt that it was just about right. So that's great. Thank you for that. So if we move on to our next slide, it's just for you to be reminded of email for the project queries is there on the screen, coastal@bcpcouncil.gov.uk. And of course, there is that website where you can go and find all the documents, all the information on consultation, and everything else that you might require. I'm just going to open up my chat again because I can see people popping things through at me. Thank you. Right, okay. Any more questions from any of you? If we don't, no, I can't see any more. Nikki, can you see the chats? My chat's disappeared. Oh no, here it goes. Right, okay. So any more questions? I think we are clear. So thank you. Yes, people have enjoyed that. Look forward to the next installments. Thank you to all the presenters. You've done a great job. Much appreciated by all. And I hope you have a very good rest of your evening. And I will say good evening to you. And please do join us for our next event. Hopefully in the future. And yes, all time to go home. Yeah. Okay, thank you, folks. Good evening. Bye.